The Student and the Vampire. His name was Menipus, and he was a student of philosophy at Corinth. He was diligent and cheerful, if not, as events would prove, terribly perceptive. One fine evening, when he was strolling by the harbor, he encountered the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. She was standing by the roadside, elegant, regal, jewels glowing at her wrists and throat. Her eyes locked with his, and she smiled. Then, to his surprise, she began to walk directly toward him. His surprise turned to astonishment when she stopped in front of him and took his hand in hers. After a moment, when he was able to find words, Menipus stammered something about never having seen the lady before. "No," she said in a musical voice, "but I have seen you." She was, she explained, the wife of a Phoenician merchant who had died and left her all alone. She had watched Menipus as he drifted around Corinth, lost in thought, and her heart had gone out to him. "Surely," she murmured, "it wouldn't be too much to ask such a kind-looking young man to keep a widow company as she walked back home?" This should have struck Menipus as a little suspicious. But he was charmed, and, as we have said, not terribly perceptive. So he walked with the stranger, out past moonlit fields and olive groves where crickets chirped, until they reached a vast and silent mansion. "Perhaps," the lady said, "you could dine with me tonight?" The doors swung open, and in they went. The glow of lamps, the glimmer of gold, and servants, troops of servants in shining silks, with trays of food and bowls of blood-red wine. The lady led Menipus into a courtyard perfumed with flowers, where a feast waited. "What is all this for?" he asked. "It is for you," she said. They reclined on the same couch. As course after course was carried out, Menipus found himself feeling woozy. The wine, he thought, must be very strong. The edges of things were getting blurry, and the woman was smiling at him, teeth gleaming in the lamplight. Perhaps, he thought, this is what it feels like to fall in love. Menipus did not return home that night. When he finally staggered into the lecture hall the following afternoon, looking exhausted and rather pale, his teacher, a wise philosopher, asked him if he was all right. "Never better," he croaked. He explained what had happened the day before, adding that he planned to marry the lady the very next day. The teacher studied him for a moment, and then asked, "Would you mind if I attended the wedding feast?" The following morning, the philosopher found Menipus and the mysterious lady at a table groaning with gold plate. He greeted the couple. Then, looking squarely at the groom, he said, "Menipus, you have been enchanted. This lady is a vampire." The lady's eyes flashed. "Go away," she hissed, "and take your lies with you." Still looking at Menipus, the philosopher took a golden cup from the table and dropped it. It dissolved into mist as it struck the floor. He picked up a plate, and as it melted away in his hand, he said, "All these things are illusions, Menipus. Open your eyes and see." And with those words, all the gold and all the servants and the house around them vanished, and the three of them were alone in a grassy field. The lady remained but a minute more, her form dissolving into that of a snake-like monster, before vanishing with a wail. The philosopher turned to Menipus, who was understandably distressed by all this, and informed him that the vampire would have drained him of blood that very night. Whether Menipus took comfort from this, our sources do not say. Although I have embellished it a bit for literary effect, the story of the student and the vampire is ancient. It appears in Philostratus's Life of Apollonius, a text written in the early 3rd century. The story reflects traditions, however, that were much older. There were several varieties of vampire in Greek myth and folklore. Perhaps the most familiar was the Lamia, a creature with the head and torso of a lady, but the body of a serpent. Lamias, we are told, would wait by lonely roads. When a man walked by, the Lamia would make its human-like upper body visible and entrance the traveler with its hypnotic gaze. When the hapless victim drew near, it would rear up, embrace him in its coils, and devour him. Then there was the Strix, a bat-like creature with a human head. This unpleasant beast was notable for its nauseating stench, piercing shriek, and insatiable thirst for blood. It hunted at night, swooping down on unwary wayfarers and children sleeping by open windows. Fortunately, like the vampires of a later era, it could be averted with garlic. Perhaps the most sinister vampires in Greek myth were the Empousa. They were sometimes described as serpent-like, and sometimes as grotesque hybrids with one leg made of brass. Unlike a Lamia or Strix, which were living creatures, an Empousa was a ghost. It could become invisible or assume the form of any animal, but its preferred shape was that of a beautiful woman, and its favorite prey was young men, as our friend Menipus discovered in the opening anecdote. An Empousa with similar designs was the antagonist of antiquity's strangest vampire story. A young man was visiting an unfamiliar city. Late one night, a beautiful woman he had never seen before appeared in his room, whispered that she needed him, and slipped into his bed. Like the horror movie character that he essentially was, the man didn't ask any questions. The woman returned the following night, and the night after, until the mistress of the house became aware of their meetings. When she saw a ring and a breastband that the visitor had left behind, she began to weep. These tokens, she told the astonished young man, had belonged to her daughter, and her daughter had been dead for 6 months. That evening, the lady and her husband lay in wait. Their eyes grew heavy. The lamps burned low. But in the darkest hour, the door swung open. And there stood their daughter, pale and with a strange light in her eyes, but the very image of her living self. They rushed forward to embrace her, and she fell to the floor, a rotting corpse. Confused and terrified, the girl's parents hurried to the family tomb. They rolled back the heavy stone door. Among the jumble of ancestral bones, they saw that their daughter's burial couch was empty, except for an iron ring that had belonged to the young man. The girl's body was taken outside the city and burned. And all the following day, the air was sweetened with the incense of purifying sacrifices. If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting Told in Stone on Patreon. You might also be interested in my book, Naked Statues, Fat Gladiators, and War Elephants. Thanks for watching.